Of Natalee Holloway finally getting the answers they say they've longed for 18 years after that Alabama teen went missing in Aruba.
If you were a teenager or a young adult in 2005, there is almost no chance you missed the name Natalee Holloway. Her face was everywhere. On the television, on the internet, in the newspapers, and on the lips of people who had never even been to the Caribbean. A beautiful 18-year-old girl from Alabama, freshly graduated from high school, full of life and possibility, disappeared on what was supposed to be the happiest trip of her young life. And then, just like that, she was gone. No body. No definitive answers. No justice. Just a haunting silence that stretched on for nearly 2 decades, broken only by lies, false leads, and the kind of cruelty that makes you question what people are truly capable of. For 20 years, her mother woke up every single morning not knowing what happened to her daughter. Think about that for a moment. 20 years of uncertainty. 20 years of hoping, grieving, fighting, and demanding answers from a system that kept coming up empty. And the man at the center of it all? He was alive, walking around, giving interviews, changing his story, and in some cases, actually trying to profit from a grieving mother's desperation. It is one of the most disturbing true crime cases in modern American history, not just because of the crime itself, but because of everything that happened afterward. The manipulation, the silence, the institutional failures, and finally, the confession that the Holloway family had been waiting for since 2005. This is the full story of what happened to Natalee Holloway, why it took so long to get answers, and why those answers, when they finally came, felt more like a gut punch than a relief. Natalee Ann Holloway was born on October 21, 1986, in Memphis, Tennessee. She grew up in the Birmingham, Alabama area, and by all accounts was the kind of person people remembered. She was smart, warm, and driven. She had just completed her senior year at Mountain Brook High School, one of the more prestigious public schools in Alabama, where she was an honor student and a member of the school's dance team. She had already been accepted to the University of Alabama on a full scholarship. Her future was not just bright, it was practically glowing. In late May of 2005, Natalee joined approximately 124 of her classmates and several chaperones on a senior class trip to Aruba, a small Dutch Caribbean island known for its white sand beaches, calm waters, and reputation as a safe tourist destination. The trip was supposed to last 5 days and serve as a celebration of everything these students had worked toward. For most of the group, it was exactly that, a carefree, joyful send-off before the responsibilities of adult life began. But for Natalee, the trip would never end. At least, not in the way anyone imagined. On the night of May 29, going into the early morning hours of May 30, 2005, Natalee and several of her classmates were at a local establishment called Carlos and Charlie's, a popular tourist bar and restaurant on the island. Witnesses reported that she was seen leaving the bar in the early hours of the morning. She was not alone. She left with 3 young men, one of whom was a Dutch teenager named Joran van der Sloot, along with 2 brothers named Deepak and Satish Kalpoe. The Kalpoe brothers were from Suriname but lived in Aruba. Joran van der Sloot was the son of a Dutch legal official who was living and working in Aruba at the time. When Natalee's travel companions gathered to board their return flight to Alabama the next morning, she was not there. Her passport and belongings were still in her hotel room. She had simply vanished. The chaperones contacted local authorities, and within hours, what had started as a missing persons report became one of the most high-profile disappearance cases in American history. The initial investigation moved quickly in some ways and frustratingly slowly in others. Aruban authorities began interviewing anyone who might have information, and attention almost immediately turned to the 3 young men who were last seen with Natalee. However, their stories did not line up from the very beginning. The accounts they gave police shifted in ways that raised serious red flags for investigators. In the early days of the investigation, Joran van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers initially told police they had dropped Natalee off safely at her hotel. It was an alibi that seemed convenient and clean, almost too clean. But it quickly began to unravel. Security footage and witness accounts did not support the story. Before long, the narrative changed. Now the story was that they had dropped her off on the beach near the Marriott Hotel. Joran claimed he left her there unharmed and walked home on his own. The contradictions between the 3 suspect stories, combined with a lack of any confirmed sighting of Natalee after she left the bar, created an atmosphere of deep suspicion. On June 9, 2005, Joran van der Sloot and both Kalpoe brothers were arrested on suspicion of involvement in Natalie's disappearance. This was not the end of the arrests. Other individuals were also briefly detained during the investigation, including 2 former hotel security guards and, at one point, Joran's own father, Paulus van der Sloot, who was questioned regarding his possible knowledge of events. None of these additional arrests led to charges. The searches for Natalie's body were extensive and heart-wrenching. Aruban authorities searched beaches, ponds, sand dunes, and landfills. The Royal Netherlands Air Force deployed aircraft equipped with infrared sensors to scan the terrain. Cadaver dogs were brought in on multiple occasions. Satellite imagery was used to detect any changes in the landscape that might indicate a burial site. The FBI worked alongside Aruban police, testing hair samples and other potential evidence. Every single lead ran cold. Every search came up empty. And with each failed attempt to find her, the emotional toll on her family deepened in ways that are almost impossible to put into words. By September 2005, a judge ordered the release of all suspects, citing insufficient evidence to hold them. The Kalpoe brothers had already been released earlier that summer. Joran van der Sloot walked out of custody, and despite remaining a person of interest, he was not charged with any crime in connection with Natalie's disappearance. The investigation continued, but without a body and without any legally admissible confession, prosecutors were essentially left without the tools they needed to move forward. What followed over the next several years is one of the more disturbing chapters of this entire case, because it shows the kind of psychological cruelty that Joran van der Sloot was capable of inflicting on a family that was already broken. Rather than fading into the background after his release, van der Sloot seemed almost drawn to the spotlight. He gave media interviews in which he offered shifting, contradictory, and at times frankly bizarre accounts of what happened that night. In a 2006 interview on Fox News, he claimed that Natalie had wanted to have a sexual encounter but that he had declined because he did not have protection, and that she had simply chosen to remain on the beach when he left. His own story contradicted itself in multiple ways, and the version he offered to the Kalpoe brothers' accounts differed significantly. Then in 2008, something remarkable happened. A Dutch journalist and crime reporter named Peter R. de Vries secretly recorded a conversation with van der Sloot in which the young Dutchman appeared to describe being present when Natalie died and disposing of her remains. The footage was aired on Dutch television and caused an international sensation. It seemed, at last, like a breakthrough. But van der Sloot quickly denied the significance of the recording, claiming he had fabricated the story to impress a drug dealer, that none of it was true, and that he had been playing a character to gain someone's confidence. Authorities looked into the footage but were unable to use it as the basis for criminal charges. Once again, justice slipped through the cracks. The most sickening chapter in the years following Natalie's disappearance came in 2010. Joran van der Sloot approached Beth Holloway, Natalie's mother, through a series of contacts and offered to reveal the location of her daughter's remains, in exchange for $250,000. Beth Holloway, desperate for closure and willing to do almost anything to bring her daughter home, agreed to provide a portion of the money up front. She gave him a down payment and waited for answers. What she received was nothing. Van der Sloot took the money and provided information that led investigators to a location that turned out to be completely false. He had looked a grieving mother in the eyes, taken her money, and given her nothing but more pain. It was an act of breathtaking cruelty. This extortion scheme is ultimately what brought van der Sloot into the American legal system. He was charged in the United States with extortion and wire fraud. But before American authorities could fully act, something even more chilling came to light. In May of 2010, exactly 5 years to the day after Natalie Holloway disappeared, Joran van der Sloot murdered a young Peruvian woman named Stephanie Flores in a hotel room in Lima, Peru. Flores had been a business student and the daughter of a prominent Peruvian racing figure. She was 21 years old. Van der Sloot was caught on surveillance cameras and arrested within days. He was convicted of her murder in Peru and sentenced to 28 years in a Peruvian prison. The fact that he had gone on to kill another young woman just 5 years after Natalie's disappearance was a deeply troubling confirmation of what many had long suspected, that Joran van der Sloot was not simply a person who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of poor judgment. He was dangerous, and the years during which he had avoided meaningful consequences had apparently done nothing to change that. 4 years after van der Sloot was imprisoned in Peru, the Holloway case remained technically open but practically frozen. There were no new leads. There was no body, and the man most suspected of being responsible was locked away in South America, apparently beyond the reach of American justice in the context of Natalie's case specifically. Families of the missing often describe their grief as existing in a kind of permanent suspension. They cannot fully mourn because there is no confirmed death, and yet they cannot move forward because there is no resolution. Beth Holloway described this experience in interviews over the years, speaking openly about the toll it had taken on her and her family. The not knowing, she said repeatedly, was its own form of torment. Then, in 2023, something shifted. American authorities pursued the extradition of Van der Sloot from Peru to face the extortion charges related to his 2010 scheme against Beth Holloway. It was a legally complex process that required cooperation between multiple governments, but it moved forward. Van der Sloot was brought to the United States, and in June of 2023, he appeared in a federal courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama. Remarkably, the very state where Natalie had grown up and where her family still lived. What happened in that courtroom was something the Holloway family had waited 18 years to hear. As part of a formal plea agreement on the extortion charges, Joran van der Sloot gave a confession. Not the kind of vague, half-truth, retractable confession he had given before. This was a legally binding statement, made as part of a plea deal, with specific details that investigators found credible and consistent with what they had long suspected. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Joran van der Sloot admitted that he had killed Natalie Holloway. According to the confession, the events of that final night unfolded on the beach after the Kalpoe brothers had driven away. Van der Sloot said that he attempted to sexually assault Natalie, and that she resisted him. He said that when she fought back, he became violent, grabbed a cinder block, and struck her in the head. She died from the blow. He then dragged her body to the ocean and disposed of it in the water. The details he provided matched certain aspects of the physical geography of the area and aligned with patterns that investigators had been aware of for years. Authorities described the confession as credible. Beth Holloway was present in the courtroom. She had advocated, pushed, fought, and refused to let her daughter's case be forgotten for 18 years. And now she was sitting in a room listening to the man who killed her daughter finally say what he had done. Her public statement afterward was both dignified and devastating. She confirmed that Van der Sloot was no longer a suspect, he was the killer. And while her voice carried the strength of someone who had fought for nearly 2 decades and finally arrived at some form of truth, there was something unmistakable behind it. The grief that never goes away, even after the answers come. There is something important to understand about why this case took as long as it did, and it has less to do with any single failure and more to do with a combination of factors that stacked on top of each other in almost every direction. The investigation in Aruba faced genuine legal and logistical challenges from the beginning. Aruban law operated differently from American law in a number of ways, and what American audiences sometimes perceived as incompetence or corruption was in some cases simply a different legal framework. That said, legitimate criticisms were also raised over the years about the handling of the investigation, including questions about whether the fact that Joran's father had legal connections on the island may have affected the speed and thoroughness of certain actions in the early days. There was also the issue of the media. The coverage of this case was enormous, sustained, and at times deeply problematic. American cable news channels ran wall-to-wall coverage of Natalie's disappearance for weeks on end, which had complicated effects. On one hand, the constant attention kept pressure on authorities and ensured that the case was never quietly buried. On the other hand, the coverage was frequently sensationalized, driven more by narrative drama than by careful journalism. Theories that had no evidentiary basis were presented as possibilities on primetime television. The emotional and sometimes aggressive tone of some of the American media coverage created friction with Aruban authorities and locals who felt their island was being unfairly portrayed. Natalie's case also became a touchstone for broader discussions about which missing persons cases receive public and media attention and which do not. Analysts and journalists pointed out, with some justification, that the Holloway case received a level of coverage that was extraordinary even by the standards of high-profile disappearances, and that cases involving young women and girls who were not white, wealthy, or conventionally attractive rarely received anything close to that level of attention. These conversations were uncomfortable but necessary, and they reflected genuine inequities in how missing persons stories are treated both by news organizations and by the public. None of this diminishes what happened to Natalie or the validity of her family's fight for justice. But it is part of the full picture of this case and what it revealed about the world that surrounded it. There is a question that Natalie's family and many members of the public have had to sit with since the confession came out in 2023. Does this count as closure? And the honest answer is complicated. On one level, yes. After 18 years of uncertainty, the family now knows what happened. They know that Natalie did not run away. They know she did not disappear of her own choosing. They know she was not in hiding somewhere, living a different life. She was murdered. She was killed by a young man she had met that night, a man who then spent the better part of 2 decades lying, manipulating, extorting, and hurting people with a callousness that is difficult to fully comprehend. Knowing that is something. Knowing the truth, even when the truth is devastating, is different from not knowing at all. But there is another dimension to closure that remains permanently out of reach for Natalie's family, and that is the ability to bring her home. Her body has never been recovered. According to Van der Sloot's confession, she was disposed of in the ocean. After 20 years, the probability of recovering her physical remains is, according to most experts, vanishingly small. The ocean does not preserve the way the ground does. Currents, tides, marine life, and the passage of time mean that whatever evidence once existed in the water has almost certainly been lost forever. Her family cannot bury her. They cannot stand at a graveside. There is no physical place where Natalie rests. This is a dimension of the case that does not receive enough attention when people talk about the confession as resolution. For families of the missing, the absence of physical remains creates a grief that is uniquely unresolvable. The truth came, finally, but Natalie herself, in any tangible sense, is beyond reach. Joran van der Sloot, as a result of the 2023 plea deal, received an additional sentence in the United States on top of his Peruvian prison term. He will spend a significant portion of the rest of his life behind bars, serving time for the crimes against Beth Holloway and with the weight of his confession on record. He will never be tried for Natalie's murder in a formal criminal sense, partly because the confession came as part of a plea on different charges, and partly because jurisdiction and evidentiary issues make a murder prosecution enormously complex in a case where there is no body and where the crime occurred on foreign soil. For many people, this feels profoundly insufficient. A man who murdered an 18-year-old girl, disposed of her body, spent 20 years lying about it, murdered another woman, and extorted a grieving mother will not face a murder conviction for what he did to Natalie. That is a hard reality to sit with. And yet, the confession itself carries a weight that cannot be entirely dismissed. It is on record. It is legally binding. It confirms what happened. And for Beth Holloway, who spent 18 years refusing to give up, who built organizations to help other families of the missing, who never stopped saying her daughter's name in public even when the world had mostly moved on, the moment in that courtroom represented something real. Not everything she deserved. Not the full justice that Natalie deserved. But something. The legacy of Natalie Holloway's case is layered and complicated in the way that most cases of this magnitude tend to be. It changed things. It forced conversations about how missing persons cases are investigated across international borders, about the challenges of coordinating justice between different legal systems, about the way media coverage can simultaneously help and harm an investigation. It highlighted the particular kind of suffering that comes from unresolved disappearances, where families are left in a state of suspended grief that can last for decades. And it ultimately served as a reminder of how long truth can be buried when the person who knows it has neither conscience nor remorse. Natalie Holloway would have turned 38 years old in October of 2024. She never got to attend the University of Alabama on her scholarship. She never got to experience the adult life that was just beginning to open up in front of her when she boarded that plane to Aruba in the spring of 2005. She was 18 years old, full of potential and warmth, and her life was taken from her by an act of senseless violence on a beach far from home.